March 3rd, 1943. Over the Bismarck Sea. The night burns. Tracer rounds carve red scars across the darkness. Below, the black ocean is alive with explosions. Ships aflame, men scrambling through fire and oil. The convoy that left for Bow only days ago is dying, one ship at a time. The air shudders as a new sound rips through the chaos. The deep, rhythmic growl of twin radial engines. Not high above, but low, dangerously low, skimming the waves. Then comes a roar, deafening, relentless, followed by a storm of light. 8.50 caliber machine, guns blaze from the nose of a single aircraft. Their tracers streak like molten chains, ripping across decks, shattering anti-aircraft guns, and cutting through human silhouettes in flashes of red and white. The Japanese called it the Demon Zipper, because its gunfire stitched death across the sea. A ship's bridge vanishes in flame. Lifeboats are shredded before they even hit the water. The air smells of fuel and burning metal. Above it all, the B-25 Mitchell howls past, guns still spitting fury. It doesn't climb. It dives, chasing destruction through the inferno. What began as a bomber had been reborn, re-engineered in jungle workshops by men who refused to fight fair. Mechanics with no blueprints. Pilots with no manuals. They ripped out bomb sights, welded extra guns, and turned a medium bomber into a monster of steel and thunder. The B-25's new nose housed 8 forward-facing Brownings, capable of spitting out over 8,000 rounds a minute, enough to strip a destroyer to its bones, enough to terrify the Japanese Navy. Japan's convoys were supposed to be untouchable, surrounded by destroyers, covered by anti-aircraft fire, defended by the Emperor's best gunners. But against the B-25 gunship, those defenses melted away. Each run lasted less than 30 seconds. But in that half-minute, entire ships died. Flames reflected off the sea like molten glass. Pilots could feel the heat through their cockpit glass as they banked hard, low, and fast, escaping only by inches from the shock waves of their own destruction. To the men below, it seemed like madness or genius. The Allies had found a weapon that didn't just bomb ships, it ripped them apart. In the months to come, this new breed of aircraft, half bomber, half gunship, would change the very rules of Pacific warfare. And it all began here, over the Bismarck Sea, where 8 guns roared and an empire began to sink. The age of the gunship had begun. By the end of 1942, the war in the Pacific had entered a dangerous stalemate. The Japanese empire still spanned half the ocean, from the jungles of Burma to the atolls of the Solomons. Their sea lanes stretched like lifelines, carrying men, munitions, and fuel from fortress ports like Rabaul to front lines across New Guinea. For the Allies, those convoys were the arteries of the enemy, and cutting them meant choking Japan's war effort. But there was a problem. America's bombers, the mighty B-17s and B-20's, had the range, but not the accuracy. From 10,000 feet, they could obliterate a city block. But a moving ship on the open ocean? That was a different story. Bombs fell wide. Convoys slipped away untouched. And each day, more Japanese troops and supplies reached the jungles of New Guinea, strengthening their grip on the region. America had the planes. They just couldn't hit what mattered. At Port Moresby, the men of the U.S. 5th Air Force faced a harsh truth. They were losing the battle for sea lanes. General George C. Kenney, a sharp, no-nonsense commander, knew something had to change, fast. The Japanese controlled the initiative. To win, the Allies needed a weapon that could strike low, hit hard, and break through the deadly web of anti-aircraft fire. That's when innovation met desperation. Among Kenney's men was a maverick, a former airline mechanic turned combat engineer named Major Paul Pappy Gunn, a wiry, stubborn man with grease under his nails and defiance in his voice. Gunn didn't wait for permission. He built what he needed. In the sweltering heat of New Guinea, using scrap metal and imagination, he began modifying the B-25 Mitchell bombers that sat idle on the airfield. He stripped out bomb sights and navigation gear, replaced glass noses with armor plating, and began mounting extra machine guns, 2, then 4, then 8. Mechanics scavenged barrels, mounts, and ammunition belts from wreck fighters. Each prototype looked rough, almost handmade, but when they fired, the ground trembled. What Pappy Gunn created wasn't in any manual. It was born of necessity, tested in the dust, and fueled by raw defiance. General Kenney saw potential. He approved Gunn's design and ordered more. Soon, air crews were training in a weapon unlike any they'd seen before. The B-25, once a medium bomber, was reborn as a low-flying assault aircraft, a battering ram built for sea warfare. The men called it a poor man's battleship, Across the Pacific, the Japanese Navy still believed their convoys were untouchable, their destroyers guns and air cover enough to keep the Americans at bay. But in the jungles of New Guinea, in dusty workshops powered by sweat and ingenuity, the Allies were building something Japan could neither predict nor defend against. And soon, the seas would run red with proof. New Guinea, late 1942. The airfields at Port Moresby were crude, steel matting laid over mud, surrounded by jungle and heat. Mechanics worked shirtless beneath corrugated tin roofs, the sound of hammers and engines blending into a constant metallic rhythm. It was here, among mosquitoes and the smell of oil, that the idea of a flying gunship was born. The B-25 Mitchell was never meant to fight this way. Designed as a medium bomber, it was reliable, fast for its class, and famously versatile. It had even raided Tokyo in the hands of Doolittle's men. But in the Pacific, it needed to become something else, something far more dangerous. A row of mechanics crouched under a B-25, sparks flying as torches cut away its glazed nose. The sound of gunmetal being bolted into place. Major Paul Pappy, Gunn's vision was simple, brutal, and effective. He tore out the bomb-aiming systems and replaced them with 8 forward-facing Browning .50 caliber machine guns, each one capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. Together, they unleashed a torrent of lead, over 8,000 rounds a minute. The result wasn't elegant, but it was terrifying. The nose of the plane now looked like the snout of a mechanical beast, blunt, armored, bristling with barrels. When it opened fire, it didn't just attack, it erased. 8 streams of tracer fire merging into one. A storm of steel that could shred a ship in seconds. But the innovation didn't stop there. Allied tacticians, working alongside Australian pilots, began experimenting with a new bombing technique, one borrowed from childhood games: skip bombing. Instead of dropping bombs from high altitude, pilots flew at wave-top height, sometimes just 30 feet above the ocean. At that speed, they would release their bombs, causing them to skip across the water like stones. When timed perfectly, the bombs slammed into the sides of ships below the waterline, detonating with devastating precision. Training for this new tactic was brutal. Pilots flew so low that the salt spray stained their windshields. Seconds separated victory from disaster. If a bomb released too early, it skipped wide, too late, and it detonated beneath the aircraft. But when it worked, the results were devastating. A test range in Port Moresby, practice ships exploding in columns of white spray as B-25's roar overhead, pilots cheering over radio chatter. Soon, the 90th Bombardment Squadron, nicknamed the Grim Reapers, became the first to operationally test Gunn's modified Mitchells. Their aircraft, blackened by oil and streaked with dust, carried names like Zombie Big Stoop and Dirty Dora. Each pilot knew their chances were slim. Flying at mast height meant facing the full fury of Japanese anti-aircraft guns. One hit could rip a wing clean off. But the pilots of the 5th Air Force didn't hesitate. They had trained for this. They trusted their machine and their gunners. The B-25 had been reborn, no longer a bomber, but a predator. And soon, over the waters of the Bismarck Sea, it would prove its worth in blood and fire. March 2nd, 1943. The waters of the Bismarck Sea were calm, deceptively so. Dawn painted the horizon in streaks of orange and gray, but beneath that beauty steamed the lifeline of Japan's army in New Guinea. 8 transport ships, carrying nearly 7,000 troops from Rabaul to La. Their decks were packed with soldiers, helmets glinting in the morning light, rifles stacked in neat rows, banners fluttering in the wind. Escorting them were 8 destroyers, veteran warships, bristling with anti-aircraft guns. Together, they formed a convoy the Japanese believed untouchable. Japanese officers scanning the skies with binoculars, gunners standing at the ready, the rhythmic thump of diesel engines echoing across the water. But far above them, unseen in the morning haze, the hunters were already closing in. Allied reconnaissance planes had spotted the formation the night before. Orders flashed across the radio network of the 5th Air Force. All available aircraft, intercept and destroy. At 10 a.m., the first American bombers appeared. B-17 Flying Fortresses, swooping from 7,000 feet. Their bombs splashed wide, missing the convoy but forcing the ships into tight defensive turns. The real attack, however, would come from the sea-skimming gunships that followed. From behind the horizon came the sound of engines, low, deep, relentless. The B-25 were coming in. Major Ed Larner led the first wave of modified Mitchells, each armed with the new 8-gun nose. Flying at just 100 feet, their shadows raced across the waves. Japanese lookouts screamed warnings. Anti-aircraft guns roared to life, filling the air with black bursts of shrapnel. But the gunships didn't climb. They dove straight into the storm. And then it began. 8 guns per plane stitched blazing lines across the decks of Japanese transports. Gunners fell before they could even return fire. Lifeboats were shredded. Command bridges vaporized in clouds of splintered steel. Ammunition boxes exploded, sending shockwaves through the decks. They called it the Demon Zipper, because the gunfire tore through ships like a metal seam being ripped open. Bullfighters joined from the flanks, spraying rockets and cannon fire into the destroyers. The air was thick with smoke and oil. Then came the skip bombers, low, steady, precise. Their bombs skipped twice across the water before slamming into hulls. Explosions erupted beneath the waves, tearing ships in half. The Japanese convoy turned into chaos. Transports collided. Men leapt overboard into flaming oil slicks. Destroyers tried to shield them, only to be gutted by direct hits. One by one, the vessels burned, floating furnaces against a horizon of black smoke. A, B, 25 sweeping across a burning transport at mast height, tracer rounds slashing through the inferno, pilots gripping throttles as explosions rocked the sea below. Each attack run lasted less than 30 seconds. But in those seconds, entire ships and the men aboard them ceased to exist. By afternoon, the battle was over. The sea was littered with debris, lifeboats, drifting bodies, burning oil slicks stretching for miles. Out of 16 Japanese ships, 12 lay on the ocean floor. More than 3,000 Japanese soldiers perished, drowned, burned, or cut down as Allied aircraft strafed survivors clinging to wreckage. The sea turned black with oil and ash. To the Americans, it was victory. To the Japanese, it was revelation that the sea itself was no longer safe. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked the end of Japan's dominance in the Southwest Pacific. Never again would they risk large troop convoys through open waters. The 8-gun B-25 had proven its worth, not as an experiment, but as a weapon of decisive power. A B-25 banking over the burning sea, sunlight glinting off its scarred fuselage, the symbol of new age in air warfare. In just a few hours, the balance of the Pacific shifted. What bombs had failed to achieve in the clouds, gunfire accomplished at wave-top height. When the smoke finally cleared over the Bismarck Sea, Japan had lost more than ships and soldiers. It had lost faith in its own defenses. Out of nearly 7,000 men who sailed for La, fewer than 1,000 would ever reach shore. The rest lay beneath the waves, entombed in twisted steel and burning oil. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was a defeat beyond tactics or numbers. It was psychological, a blow that struck at the very heart of Japan's confidence at sea. In Tokyo, the high command was stunned. Their intelligence reports described the Allied attack as unprecedented in violence. Pilots spoke of American planes coming in too fast to target, strafing the decks with streams of fire that seemed endless. Survivors whispered of the Demon Zipper, the sound of death unzipping their ships from bow to stern. What Japan had once considered a manageable threat, low-level air attack, had evolved into something new, something far beyond their doctrine. The 8-gun B-25 was the embodiment of that change. In a matter of weeks, word spread across the Pacific. From Rabaul to Truk, from the Philippines to the Solomon Islands, Japanese convoy commanders began to dread the low growl of twin engines skimming the horizon. Convoy routes that had been lifelines were now gauntlets of fear. Sailors began traveling at night, hugging coastlines, hiding beneath tropical storms. Even destroyer escorts, once symbols of protection, proved helpless. The B-25's sheer wall of lead could silence their guns before they even locked onto a target. Japanese sailors staring into smoke-filled horizons, a convoy captain clutching binoculars as his crew scrambles to battle stations. The eerie hum of distant engines, growing louder. The Japanese called it Shinen no Kaminari, thunder from the abyss. But fear wasn't confined to the sea. The success of the gunship forced Japan to reevaluate its air strategy. Airfields that had once relied on massed anti-aircraft batteries now face an aircraft that can annihilate gun positions at point-blank range. Defensive lines were shredded by low-level strafing runs. The very tactics that had secured Japan's early victories, discipline, formation, predictability, now worked against them. Meanwhile, American engineers pushed the design even further. What began as an improvisation on a dusty airstrip was now an official weapon of war. The U.S. Army Air Forces greenlit new production models, the B-25G and B-25H. The B-25H in particular became a flying fortress of its own kind, featuring not just machine guns, but 75mm cannon mounted directly in its nose, the same weapon used on Sherman tanks. When fired, the recoil shook the entire airframe, but the results were devastating. Japanese barges, bunkers, and coastal batteries simply disintegrated, the gunship firing its 75mm cannon, the blast lighting up the cockpit, Japanese soldiers ducking for cover as shells pulverized wooden positions. Against this, Japan had no answer. No weapon, no tactic, no prayer counting the tide of innovation now sweeping across the Pacific. Some Japanese officers even believed the B-25's were armored, impervious to small arms fire. Rumors spread of invincible planes that shrugged off flak and dove headlong into destruction. In truth, the aircraft were still fragile, but their courage and coordination made them appear unstoppable. By mid-1943, the 8-gun B-25 had transformed air combat. What once required formation of heavy bombers could now be done by a handful of men flying at treetop height. The Pacific's vast distances, once a shield for Japan, had become a trap. Every convoy, every outpost, every isolated garrison was now vulnerable to the roar of gunfire sweeping in from the sea. The Japanese Navy had built its empire on mastery of the ocean, but the B-25 gunship proved that control of the air could drown an empire just as surely as torpedoes ever could. The Pacific balance had shifted, and Japan's invincibility, once myth now memory, began to unravel. By 1944, the Pacific War had changed beyond recognition. The tide that once carried the rising sun across half the world now ebbed with every American advance. But behind each island captured, each convoy destroyed, there was a new kind of symbol, not a flag, not a battleship, but the silhouette of a twin-engine plane, roaring low, its nose glinting with 8 dark barrels. The B-25 Iron 8. What began as a field modification, a desperate experiment on a dusty airstrip in New Guinea, had become one of the most feared aircraft in the Pacific. It wasn't just the firepower. It was what that firepower represented. Ingenuity, improvisation, the raw will to survive and adapt in the chaos of war. Slow pan across wrecked Japanese ships half submerged off New Guinea's coast. Engineers refitting planes under canvas hangars. A pilot cleaning his Browning barrels by lamplight. The 8-gun B-25's and their successors, the B-25G and B-25H, carried the fight across the Philippines, Burma, and China. They struck rail lines, airfields, coastal gun batteries. Anything that moved, anything that mattered. Their legend grew not just from victories, but from the fear they inspired. Pilots who flew them described the sensation as flying a thunderstorm. When the guns opened up, the vibration shook to the cockpit. Brass casings rained against the floor, and the horizon disappeared in smoke and tracer fire. It wasn't elegant, but it was effective. The B-25 wasn't built in a lab. It was built in the minds of men who refused to lose. And that spirit lived on long after the war ended. The lessons learned from the B-25 gunship directly shaped the design of future close air support and gunship aircraft. When the U.S. returned to war in Korea and later Vietnam, its skies once again thundered with the sound of forward-firing guns. The AC-47 Spooky, the AC-119 Shadow, and finally the mighty AC-130 Spectre all owed their existence to the first idea born in 1942, a plane that doesn't drop bombs from afar, but fights face-to-face. Archival footage of AC-130 gunships lighting up the night sky. Crossfade back to World War II footage of AB-25 unleashing its guns across the sea. For Japan, the B-25 left scars that ran deeper than steel. The Imperial Navy's doctrine, built on precision and superiority, had been humbled by raw creativity. Convoy routes that once linked the empire were severed. Morale, already strained, collapsed further. Soldiers stranded on distant islands spoke of the iron planes that haunted the sea, appearing from nowhere, vanishing into clouds. The fear outlasted the war. Even in captured diaries, Japanese sailors wrote their disbelief that such firepower could come from a single aircraft. They imagined entire squadrons, when often only a few B-25's had done the work. The B-25 didn't just destroy ships. It destroyed the illusion of invincibility. And yet, in its destruction, there was creation, the dawn of a new philosophy of warfare. That victory doesn't always belong to the biggest fleet, the heaviest armor, or the most advanced design. Sometimes, it belongs to the ones willing to think differently. As the Pacific quieted and Japan surrendered, many B-25 were scrapped, their guns silenced, their pilots scattered home. But their legacy roared on the DNA of every gunship that followed. Their descendants fly even now, in Afghanistan and Iraq, in every corner of the modern battlefield where close support means survival. Each burst of cannon fire, each pass through smoke and flame, carries a whisper from the past. A whisper from 1943, from the low skies of the Bismarck Sea, from the pilots who turned scrap metal and courage into history. They called it the Demon Zipper. But history remembers it as something greater, the sound of ingenuity, tearing through the darkness of war. Soft echo of machine guns fades into silence, replaced by the gentle hum of engines disappearing into cloud.